Uh, Welcome. Thank you all for being here. Before we get started, I just want to tell you that I am so happy to be having this event because we never get to talk about history and historians. We always talk about politics and the law and foreign policy, and it's all very interesting, but those of you who know me know that I like the history. And I actually think it would have been a very good thing for the country if more historians were weighing in more frequently, and people who write about politics in a historical vein, and people who think about what's come before. And we don't have enough of it, and so this is our meager attempt to try to do that. Before we get started, let me just say that this is being recorded by C-SPAN. You know the routine, which means that when you get the mic, speak into the mic, wait for the mic before you speak, and be aware of the fact that it's being recorded. So before we get started with our discussion, let me introduce the men to my left. Jim Banner, who edited the book Presidential Misconduct, which is sort of our kickoff for our discussion tonight, is a visiting scholar in history at George Washington University, having spent most of his career teaching at Princeton. He's the founding director of the History News Service. His most recent book is Being a Historian, An Introduction to the Professional World of History. Again, I think it is somewhat about the profession and the worldview. He's edited and written numerous books, including the one we're featuring tonight. And he also was one of the creators of the National History Center. Jackson Lears is the Board of Governors Professor of History at Rutgers University. He's the editor-in-chief of Raritan, the Quarterly Review. Let me tell you how I know Jackson. So I was a graduate student at Yale, and people would always say, oh, there's this great historian. He's going to be so great. You were a few years older. Just in full disclosure, you were a few years older. But he was one of the stars in graduate school, and he proceeded to define a field, which is basically how to think about culture in a way that spoke to many different parts of our political life. That might not be how he describes himself, but that's how I'm describing you. And so we're very happy to have him. His most recent book is Rebirth of a Nation, The Making of Modern America, 1877 to 1920. And he writes constantly for the New York Review of Books and the London Review of Books, and very much worth reading. Rick Hertzberg, to his left, is a journalist known for many things. Tonight, I'd like to introduce him in a number of ways. First, as being the speechwriter for Jimmy Carter, and we're going to talk a little bit about Jimmy Carter. He's known as one of the preeminent editors in the United States. He's worked twice at the New Republic. He's most identified these days with the New Yorker magazine, which he was executive editor of, and also is given a lot of credit for refashioning it, I guess, during the Tina Brown years. He's been a finalist for the National Magazine Award 6 times. And he's won that award once for his comment, which is in the Talk of the Town in the New Yorker. His most recent book is Obamanos, The Birth of a New Political Era. To his left is Eric Alterman. Eric's kind of all of the categories at once. He's a historian, he's a journalist, he's a critic. It depends on what day he wakes up, where he is. But right now, he's the CUNY Distinguished Professor for English and Journalism at Brooklyn College. He's a media columnist for The Nation. He's written 10 books. He's going on his 11th, which is coming out in June and is titled, it's titled Lying in State, Why Presidents Lie and Why Trump is Worse. He's a contributor to New Yorker, The Atlantic, Rolling Stone, many other publications. He's written about politicians from our own de Blasio to George Bush, Barack Obama, and many others. So I'm hoping that among these panelists tonight, we can get some sense of proportionality about what's happening in the country today, what it means, and where we're headed. And so to kick off the discussion, I'm going to turn to Jim Banner. And what I'd really like you to tell us briefly is why the reissue of this book, which originally came out in 1974, why are we seeing it again?
I'm happy to do that, Karen. I want to say first, however, that I do have some views about the Trump presidency, but I'm going to keep my powder dry until we get into a general discussion. History has a way of catching even historians by surprise, and I was caught up in a project 45 years ago to present to the impeachment inquiry of the House Judiciary Committee, at the request of its special counsel, John Doerr, a contextual survey of presidential misconduct from George Washington through the administration of Lyndon Johnson. With about 14 other historians under the general editorship and management of C. Van Woodward, the celebrated historian of the South, then at Yale. In 8 weeks, we prepared a report, submitted it to John Doerr. He accepted it and was getting ready to present the report to the members of the Judiciary Committee, and the president resigned. I always hoped that that would give me some license to say that I had had something to do with Niskin's resignation. But it didn't, because it turns out that the report never got into the hands of the members of the impeachment inquiry. But the text was in the public domain. It was grabbed up by Dell Publishing House, published in cloth and paper editions, but after Nixon had resigned. And the books fell dead in the marketplace. It is scarcely known among historians. And it was reviewed only once by me. And it's entirely irregular, but I arranged it with the journal editor to do so because I wanted to sort of to report on a footnote to the impeachment inquiry and to get some matters about the state of administrative and political history off my chest. But that was the end of it. And then I went on about my life as a historian. And a year ago, this past September, I was sitting in my office working on another book on a completely different subject. The phone rang, and the voice said, "Jim, yes, this is Jill Lepore." And Jill is a fellow historian on the Harvard faculty, and a lot of you know her as an author for the New York, writer for the New Yorker. I said, "Well, nice to hear from you. What are you calling about?" I said, "What the hell is this book?" And she just stumbled upon it in a footnote, gone to the Widener stacks, pulled it off, and found out that in 45 years it had been taken out 3 times. So if Jill Lepore didn't know about it, it had to have been an insignificant book. Well, darn it, she's brought it back, the whole subject and the significance, because she wrote about it for the New Yorker, and then all hell broke loose at my desk, and I eventually turned it over to my agent, and the result is this updated version of a report that was first written and submitted to the Congress 45 years ago, and I'm still alive to tell the tale. This book goes through the presidency of Barack Obama. The original one did not cover the Nixon presidency. This one does not touch upon Donald Trump for 2 very strong reasons. One, previously and now, the administrations that occasion a report like this are not complete. And second of all, of course, most of the documentation about the history of Nixon's administration wasn't available then, and certainly of Trump's administration now. And it's only fair that we left then, we leave now the sitting president out of it. I want to say 2 things about the nature of the report that's contained in this book. 3 things. First of all, it is not the kind of history that I and my colleagues would think of producing. It's very much against the grain. It's denatured, factual, uninterpretive. It's really a chronicle, the kind of history that was written through the Middle Ages and well beyond, episode by episode, reign by reign, papacy by papacy, president to president, and no connective tissue, just what happened about certain aspects of the presidencies going back to George Washington. The second place, a report about presidential misconduct over 230 years may, as Van Woodward said 45 years ago in the introduction to the Dell edition of that report, unprecedented. This book is only slightly precedented because there really is no scholarly, serious academic field of presidential misconduct. And it's, in many respects, it's a very narrow way to interpret and to try to evaluate the strengths of presidencies. I mean, after all, if we're going to look at a presidency, we're going to try to, we're going to evaluate it on the vision with which it takes office, its success in implementing that vision, the political skills that the administration, the president and his official family bring to the job, the obstacles they face, the crises that suddenly beset them, and so on. So to evaluate presidencies on the grounds of misconduct doesn't make great and strong sense. I mean, take, for example, the presidency of Warren Harding. It lasted for 2.5 years and was one of the most corrupt in American history. But it turns out that President Harding was as white, as unblemished as the driven snow. I mean, he himself wasn't corrupt. It was all the people around him. It took advantage of him. He was naive, didn't set down the laws. He didn't read his administration.
He was a sex maniac.
Was it? Yes. Oh, a sex maniac.
Yeah.
Well,
That's
you and
the
I'll
interesting
you
thing
and I'll
about
have to
his
talk about that later. Okay. I mean, and we're by the way, my colleagues and I for these two reports have not gotten into private life or life before or after the presidency. But take Harry Truman's presidency, for example. It was really quite corrupt in many ways. The president wasn't, but those around him did a lot of illegal and corrupt things. But who would judge the Truman presidency on the grounds of misconduct? Look what it did. It ended the Second World War. It integrated the armed forces. It was on it's on its watch the Marshall Plan came into being. The Truman Doctrine, and things like that. I mean, it was an administration of extraordinary achievement. The second point I'd like to make before falling silent is the following. That is that I think when I think of what we have wrought, I think of that old lame vaudeville joke. How's your wife? Compared to whom? I mean, what are we, it's hard to know what to make of the record that we have created. At least it's hard for me to do so because we don't have any comparative signposts. It seems to me that we need to know more about our kindred representative democracies, Britain, France, Germany, Scandinavian countries, Japan, South Korea, and compare the record that we've amassed with the records of misconduct or good behavior on the part of governments elsewhere. But I'm not even certain that should be the comparison that we should run. Maybe we should compare the record that we've amassed against the records of states and cities. And then it seems to me, if you compare this record against, say, Rhode Island, Louisiana, Chicago, it may look pretty good. So I come away from our own account, not certain as to whether I should feel depressed or whether I should feel rather confident that somehow we've muddled through with the defective institutions that we have, but institutions such as congressional investigations, the courts, a robust press, nonprofit organizations, aroused citizens such as the Women's March and so on, that keep the system more or less in check and with only occasional breakthroughs and eruptions such as we're experiencing today. Now, I do feel confident in making some comparisons later on, but I want to hear what my fellow panelists say before I do so.
Rick, I want to turn to you next because I want to hear your reflections on what presidential misconduct is. Then we can get Eric to talk about lying, but just the range of things that are touched on in this book, but even beyond this book. What does actually this word misconduct mean, and what doesn't it mean, and how should we think about it, both in the long perspective and in the very short perspective of what's in front of our eyes?
Well, I think I'm the only one up here who's done time in the White House. True. So naturally, when I got my copy of presidential misconduct, I eagerly turned to the Jimmy Carter section. And I have to say that the section could have been replaced with a one-liner.
With what?
With a one-liner. that would have just said, nothing to see here, move on. His scandals, such as they were, derived from, I think, partly from the fact that he had never served. The only time he'd ever served in the federal government was when he was in the Navy. He didn't know anybody to speak of outside of Georgia. And and so the scandals, such as they were, like the Burt Lance scandal, derived partly, or maybe mostly, from the fact that he brought with him the people that he trusted in Georgia, and not all of them were, by Washington standards, trustworthy. So that, but the real, I think the real problem with President Carter was that he was inexperienced, and I would say that the mistakes he made, particularly at the beginning, could be largely explained in that way. He put a cousin of his in charge of the sort of White House housekeeping operations. And as a result, the sort of penny pinching kind of ethic that he had brought with him from Georgia resulted in some mistakes that were more damaging, really, than any of the so-called scandals. For example, the newspaper subscriptions were all canceled. That was to save a few bucks. Perhaps the worst one, I think, was that he sold the Sequoia. If you remember, that was the presidential yacht, and that turned out to be a mistake of the first order, because he was trying to de-royal the White House, so he gave up Hail to the Chief. And he thought, well, geez, the president should not have a yacht. He doesn't need a yacht. So he sold it, and it was a very costly mistake, because the yacht was a real money saver. With the yacht, he could take half a dozen senators out for a nice trip up and down the Potomac, serve them some bourbon and water, and of course he had also banned alcohol from the premises, from the White House.
Hard alcohol.
Hard alcohol, there's beer.
Beer and wine.
Occasionally, yeah. But hard liquor works better when you're trying to make a deal. So instead of, so he had to, when he compromised, he had to give up something of real value. And a lot of those concessions could have been replaced much more cheaply by trips on the Potomac. I think that was a scandal of sorts, a scandal derived from being too good, too moral. Now maybe someone will be able to point out to me things that I've overlooked about the Carter administration. And the way we did, I think the book, which is really full of revelations, defines scandal perhaps rather narrowly. It doesn't really include policy scandals. It doesn't include the Lyndon Johnson section, if I remember correctly, doesn't include the Vietnam War, which I suppose you could call a scandal. It was certainly a horrible mistake. Perhaps even worse was the invasion of the Dominican Republic under Johnson, where the Dominican Republic had come into the hands of essentially a social democratic regime.
Those limitations were set for us by John Doerr. I mean, in effect, the
Yes.
Congress
Yes,
prohibited us from getting into that.
and so misconduct, I can't recall any of that from the Carter administration. Maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong. Burt Lance had his problems, and Jimmy Carter trusted Burt Lance. He brought Burt Lance. There was sort of the lack of Washington insiders was a handicap for Carter. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Well,
for
I
the
just want to
moment.
wait one follow-up question, because
Yeah.
we can come back to it later, but at what point at all, or did it not, become evident inside the White House group that the lack of insiders was a problem?
Well, in the speechwriting office, James Fallows was my boss at the beginning, and later I became chief speechwriter. It became evident before we'd even come to the office. That seemed pretty clear to, at least to our little cabal.
Interesting. So Jackson, give us some reflection before we get into individual presidents, just on how you think about this word misconduct and what it means in terms of how we should think about ideology, policy, sexual scandal, whatever it is. Just
Well, I'm in favor of a much broader definition of misconduct than much of what we've been talking about so far. When you start to get into policy, then you're beginning to speak my language. Because I feel like the most serious presidential misconduct and the sort of misconduct that has been most destructive to human lives and liberties, both at home and abroad, has occurred at a specific historical moment, what we historians call a moment, which is really the last 70 years, since the 1940s, since the emergence of the imperial presidency and the national security state, and particularly the intelligence agencies, which, as you know, can operate without control or even oversight, and remain largely invisible to the American population at large. And I think it's really interesting that in Jim's reissue of the book, the two presidents whose administrations do warrant broader coverage of misconduct are Richard Nixon and George W. Bush. And both of these presidents were engaged in, I think, serious abuse of power through the institution of domestic spying by the CIA, which is clearly against the CIA charter, and which was begun under LBJ, directed at protesters against the Vietnam War and other dissidents, and Nixon expanded that program considerably. And Operation Chaos was finally exposed by the journalist Seymour Hersh in the early 1970s when he had a brief gig at the New York Times. And his exposures provoked the hearings that were conducted by Senator Frank Church into the misdeeds of the CIA. And the committee discovered all sorts of evidence of disturbing misdeeds, not only the spying on U.S. citizens who happened to oppose Nixon's policies, but also the successful and presidentially authorized CIA coup in Chile, the overthrow of the democratically elected Salvador Allende. And what was interesting to me about this is how there is this fusion most of the time between the presidency, the executive branch, and the rest of the national security state, in particular the intelligence agencies. But sometimes there's tension. There was tension under the Kennedys for a variety of complicated reasons. There was very little tension under Nixon, and that's when the government and the presidency committed, in my view, the most egregious misdeeds and was, I think, guilty of the most extraordinary misconduct. I would say the same thing is true of the George W. Bush administration, which provided a new lease on life for the national security state after the very brief moment of public skepticism spawned by the the Church Committee and the failures of the Vietnam War. But the global war on terror really brought it back, and it really brought back the possibilities for, I would argue, the most serious kinds of misconduct. Warrantless electronic surveillance, which is a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment, torture and the tortuous legal memos devised to justify it, which is a clear violation of the Eighth Amendment and of the
Fifth
Geneva
and
Conventions.
the fifth.
And this is, these are the conventions that Dick Cheney labeled as quaint. So we are in the presence of various levels of misconduct, it seems to me, ranging from Warren Harding's encounter with a chambermaid at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco to other more serious matters that involve public policy and larger public impact. And I want to broaden the scope of our discussion to include those larger issues.
Yeah, so let me just talk to you about this quaint. This is Al Gonzalez, actually, who said this about the Geneva Conventions.
Right.
But actually, one of the things I'd like to hear you, and then I'm going to turn to Eric, think about is, are we really living in a different paradigm? I mean, I know this book lays out, presidential misconduct, almost like we normalize it, whether it's about policy or about personal life or whatever it is, just by saying, yeah, there's misconduct in all these different administrations. Eric's going to tell us how Trump's lying is worse than any other president. But before that, I just want to ask you, one of the things about the war on terror, let's take I agree with you that the war on terror changed the presidency and the executive in ways that it is quaint now. And so my question to you is, do you agree with that? Are we really in a different paradigm? Or are we just going to, in 10 years, we're going to issue another book, Presidential Misconduct, updated once again? Or are we really living in a different place because of the growth of the national security state?
Well, I fear that we are living in a different place. I'm also deeply suspicious of pronouncements about new paradigms because it
Sure.
reminds me of Bill Gates and other futurologists predicting the utopian future that awaits us after the bumpy transition. Well, transition is where people live. This is not, this is not something that we can escape that easily. This is everyday life, and our everyday lives, and this is partly due to technology, as you know, and the capacity of the NSA and other government agencies. But let's just focus on the NSA since they were devoted to this activity. And the kinds of revelations that Edward Snowden made with respect to the gathering, a dragnet really, that encompassed all Americans, that enlisted and still enlists Google and Facebook and the rest to monitor our conversations, our internet visits. There's a long list. We all know about this. People have, what makes me worry that there is a new, if not a new paradigm, there's a new public mentality, is the number of people I know, and especially not only younger people, but often younger people, who say, well, why should I care if all of my data is out there? First of all, I've done nothing wrong, and secondly, I can't do anything about it anyway. If the phone company already knows these things about me, why should I care if the government knows these things about me? Well, the problem with if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear approach is that nobody ever says that about the Snowden revelations, who lived under a dictatorship. No one from Germany says that. No one from Russia or the former Soviet Union says it. No one from Chile says it. You could continue that list. It's people in the U.S. who have, yes, we have a government that has abused its powers grievously, but we have not yet reached the condition that the Germans were in under Nazism or communism. And I think that there's a certain naivete as well as a belief that technology has brought us into this new era, and we have to adjust to it. there's a kind of technological determinism. You know, the train has left the station and we better be on it. And my feeling is, you know, we should be able to hail that train and stop it and back it up if we want to. That's called public policy. That's called politics. We don't have to just accede to technological determinants here.
Eric, I want to turn to you. Before we get to Trump, talk a little bit about how you see the role of lying in terms of the presidency, the contract between the president and the citizenry, and where you think it fits into this discussion about misconduct overall.
Well, it's a big topic, obviously.
We have all night.
This is my second, I just finished, it's in copy editing, but I just turned in my second book about presidential lying. My first book came out in 2004, I think. And in the first book, I said, I concluded that presidents shouldn't lie. And now I don't feel that way anymore. I really don't. I think lying is a part of life. I think everybody lies, or just about everybody lies. And politicians, just about all politicians lie. And if you look at how presidents are judged, the ones who lied are not any less popular or any less successful than the ones who didn't lie. Jimmy Carter hardly ever lied. Barack Obama didn't lie. John Kennedy lied all the time. Franklin Roosevelt lied a tremendous amount. And he saved Western civilization by lying, I would argue. To be the President of the United States, to be the President of the United States, you almost have to lie because people can't handle the truth. For the first century and a half of American history, I would say presidents lied for two reasons. One was, well, they lied about slavery. They lied about the nature of human beings. But they lied because America was committed to endless expansion. Every president was sort of responsible for expanding the country, and yet people didn't want Mexicans or Central Americans or American Indians or free blacks to have the same rights that they had. So they had to, in order for these two things to happen, they had to continually lie about what was actually happening and how these people were being treated. And that went on and on as the country expanded. The most consequential liar of the first American century is James Polk, who increased the size of the country by 25% with the war that he lied to get into. Interestingly, the hero of the truth of that story was Abraham Lincoln, who tried to hold him to account as a first-term congressman and lost his seat over it. And as we became an empire, empires demand lies because they're very ugly business and people don't want to hear the truth about that. So presidents, by and large, lied about it. Woodrow Wilson didn't lie personally. Teddy Roosevelt did lie. Hoover, interestingly, I couldn't find a single lie that Hoover told. But once you, Warren Harding only lied about his sex life. He didn't lie about the scandals. He wasn't personally involved. But once you get into the modern post-war period, beginning with World War II and after, we become an empire, and we define our national security in such a way that anyone who does anything we might not like has to be stopped, and yet we can't admit to that. And so lying becomes a part of being president. Actually, the United States didn't overthrow Chile. We didn't do that coup, but we did overthrow, under Eisenhower, we overthrew Guatemala and Iran directly. And yet Eisenhower, and also Indonesia and the Congo, all four of those things happened under Eisenhower. And yet he's considered a wonderful guy. Everybody wants him to be their grandfather, you know. All those presidents lied a lot. Kennedy lied about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and again, it's a terrific lie. I'm really glad he did it. You can't really generalize about lies. Nixon was a terrible person, and his lies were incredibly damaging. I don't think for the same reasons that Jackson says. I think they were damaging because they killed millions and millions of people. He could have ended the Vietnam War repeatedly, but he didn't want to because he thought it would be bad politics. We have these actual discussions where Kissinger and he say these things. George W. Bush, of course, is responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of people and the creation of millions of refugees on the basis of lies. So when you get to Trump, interestingly, Trump is not in their league in terms of the number of people killed and the chaos caused in the world, and yet he's told approximately 14,000 falsehoods. Not all of them are lies, but most of them are. And Trump is we're in a new era with Trump, because these other presidents, as horrible as what they did as what Nixon did and George W. Bush did, and Ronald Reagan, we haven't mentioned, but he was a terrible liar, although he gave the impression of believing his lies. As horrible as they were lying for a purpose that we understood that they were lying for, and we kind of knew that they were lying. And they ran basically competent governments that had individual obsessions of the president themselves that went too far, and they were reined in over time. Johnson too. Whereas Trump has destroyed any distinction between truth and lies, and he just doesn't care. I mean, all he's done his whole life is lie. And he lied when he ran for president. He lied in the debates. It was amazing to me what he was getting away with. And he didn't stop as president. The very first day of his presidency, he went to the CIA and started lying before the cameras. And so he's attacking our way of life. He's attacking our government. He is preparing. It's quite consistent, interestingly, with what Hannah Arendt wrote in the Origins of Totalitarianism, which she wrote in 1951, that if you want to destroy people's ability to resist, you have to destroy the distinction between truth and lies, because if they can't believe anything, they can't act. And I don't want to compare the United States to Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia. I reject those comparisons in every way. But there's an awful lot of similarity to the way those dictators treated truth and the way Trump's supporters go along with it than as happened in both of those places. And I think there are elements of totalitarianism in Trump's presidency and the movement that derive specifically from his ability to keep lying. And I think if he were to be reelected, I'm not sure that our form of government would survive it. But I don't know, I like to think I'm a historian, so I don't make predictions. But it's a new situation, and we don't even have the words for it. I mean, I'll stop here, but think about Fox News. There's never been anything like Fox News. We know what state TV is, and we know what independent TV is, but we don't really know what Fox is. It's something brand new, and it reinforces the lies. So if you wanted to tell the truth, you wouldn't be. You would have to contend with them defining the truth as lies. And they're very powerful. So what my book started out, my new book, it started out as a history of presidential lying, and I had to fight with my editors about this. But it became about a culture of lying, and how the president is part of that culture, and he's the most important symbol of it, and maybe the most important liar. But it's a much bigger problem than just Trump.
Jim, you wanted to weigh in?
Can I, accepting what you said, can I shift categories for a minute regarding President Trump? I think that the crisis that we face is graver than most politicians, most of us, most journalists understand. If I read the record correctly, and I'd like to know whether all five of us read it the same way, the most egregious departure from normal corruption, using public office for private gain, telling lies, covering up, occurred under Richard Nixon. And you read an account of Richard Nixon's presidency, whether in this book or other books on that presidency, and the account is really dizzying and what was going on. But Nixon's departure from previous embodiments of corruption and miscreants and wrongdoing was the fact that Nixon and his advisors were orchestrating misconduct, illegality, corruption from the White House. I mean, it had never been done in that fashion before. Nixon was a party to the misconduct, for which he eventually had to resign because he probably would have been voted out of office by the Senate. After Nixon, it seems to me that the next most serious moment of presidential misconduct came during the Iran-Contra affair of Ronald Reagan, who went to his death saying that he knew nothing about it. And I think that he probably did know something about it, but the evidence, as I read it, is not entirely clear. But here was a case in which there was that policy was being made out of the White House in contravention to congressional act. Money was being taken from one pocket for which it was authorized and appropriated and used for other purposes. This was a shadow cabinet or shadow group of officers working against the law. What the Trump presidency has done is to combine both. Trump and the people in the White House are orchestrating illegal behavior, and they're doing it now with a shadow government a shadow cabal that operates outside the White House. And we've never had that before. And this is a step up or a step down in the nature of presidential and administrative misbehavior. And I think we've got to understand it structurally that way. I mean, it's certainly true that the president lies all the time, but I've always thought that was gestational. Namely, that's the way he came out of the womb. The same way he came out of the womb, probably ADD, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and so on. There are certain things that I believe now that are not intentional. He cannot help himself. He's a man of low character, and he lies, and he's incompetent, and he's ignorant. We sort of know those things, but how do we make sense of this presidency in the long history of presidential behavior, the behavior of administrations from George Washington's to today? And I think that you can see, unfortunately, an accretion in misconduct, and in this case, it's structurally different and more grave than any we've ever had.
Rick, you talked about the sort of bringing in the people who are inexperienced, which is a comparison that's also often made with the Trump administration, bringing people in who are not experts in what they're doing, who have never worked in whatever field they're in before, and you see it throughout various different departments. Do you take what Jim's saying, which is basically that, this kind of shadow government is a new, combining this with what's going on coming out of the White House is sort of a new marriage? Or do you really see this as, we've seen corruption before, we're going to see it again, we've seen a grab for power before, we've seen interference in foreign affairs done behind the scenes before? How do you assess the difference in this administration or not?
Well, I'm not sure how to do that.
Sorry.
But there is something new and different about the Trump experience. He doesn't have politics. He doesn't have any
Yeah, that's right.
policy preferences. We've never had a president who, I think your diagnosis of several well-recognized mental disorders is on the money. He is, it could be worse. It could be worse. He hasn't gotten us into any wars. He doesn't want to have a war, to the extent that he has any thoughts about that at all. He wants, it's astounding that he uses the office to enrich himself in such an obvious and unmistakable way. That, and I think what Eric said about Fox News and the growth of of a kind of state television, the kind of thing which you see in a lot of much less morally developed countries than you see here. That is I'm not sure that Trump would have been possible without that. You have, I mean, I think everybody in this room, probably watches CNN or MSNBC. I don't think is there anybody in this room who gets their news from Fox News? I don't see, no hands are raised.
All pariahs. Anyone who raises his hand is a pariah.
And so many of the things, I'm not sure I'm on topic and
No, you
for
are.
your question,
You are.
but you have now an enormous part of the interested public. I mean, people who watch Fox are also interested in the news, who simply don't know and cannot know what's going on. They're living in a completely different reality than the rest of us. We like to think, and I think accurately, that what we know, the news that we get, is pretty much true. And we're astounded day after day that he hasn't just been hustled out of there because the things that outrage us day after day after day are unknown to a large part of the public. And that is certainly a new development.
Jackson, I'd like you to kind of weigh in here on how, I get the national security state part, and I'm with you on that, but it's sort of what Eric was saying. It's more than that. There's a whole cultural, and you even say it about, the not caring about your privacy and this kind of, new point in time. What's the cultural ramifications, do you think? And again, I don't mean that you have to predict, but if you were going to write the history of the next 10 years, what would you be looking at culturally to understand how the presidency, whether it's the result of the war on terror presidencies or now, had fundamentally changed? And what would you look at other than Fox News?
Well, I'm glad you didn't ask me to predict anything. The last political prediction I made was that Jimmy Carter was going to save American capitalism. I guess that happened, but I don't know whether he did it or not. Capitalism muddled through, it always does. I don't know.
I'll have to get the details on that.
Yeah. With respect to, well, it was a hopeful time. They just passed through the valley of the shadow, right? I'm very discouraged and depressed about the state of our public life and the prospects for the next 10 years. And I have to tell you, it's not just because of Trump, who is, a dangerous man, a genuine menace. I agree with all of that. With respect to the culture of lying, though, I still feel like we have to get beyond personal characteristics and even personal pathologies. One can find pathologies in almost anywhere,
Yeah.
and Trump's are just more flagrant than most. But it seems to me, in terms of a political culture of lying, I have to go back. I'm sorry, I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but to the creation of the national security state, in particular, the creation of an agency, the CIA, that was explicitly designed to produce disinformation, the original fake news. And there are a lot of, I think Fox News is equally dangerous, certainly as dangerous in its own way as Trump in terms of twisting our discourse. But I don't believe CNN, and I don't believe MSNBC either, and I think they're about as close to state media as you can get. They're just a different part of the state. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they will conjure up, they will produce unnamed officials, unnamed official sources without tracking them down. Journalism is in such a bad condition here, and it's not just because of the internet and the concentration of power in a handful of media companies, although that's crucial. Those are both crucial. But I think the practice of journalism has suffered terribly, really since the early 2000s, maybe longer. For me, a critical moment is in 1978, when Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, has been convicted of lying to Congress about his role in the CIA coup against Allende. And he cops a plea and pays a $2,000 fine, and the Times runs an editorial praising this plea and saying, yes, this rebalances the need to enforce the laws against lying with the continuing need to keep secrets. So from that day forward, any CIA official who took the oath of secrecy that is required of that organization could get up before Congress and lie his head off. And they have done it since then, repeatedly, including a good many of the ones who are now who are serving as commentators for CNN and MSNBC.
Eric, do you want to comment?
As professional wise men.
First of all, I'm very angry that Jackson keeps putting me in the position of having to defend Nixon and Kissinger and CIA in this one tiny little way. CIA wanted to overthrow Allende. They didn't do it. They tried a couple times and then gave up. And Allende was overthrown by his own generals. And when the coup came, Nixon turned to Kissinger and said, did we do this? Because he wanted to take credit for it, because he was so impressed with the way Eisenhower had overthrown these governments. And Kissinger said, no, actually, we didn't. And then he says, well, maybe we created the conditions for it, because he knew he was disappointing Nixon when he said we didn't do it. But Allende was overthrown by his own generals. They would have liked to overthrow him. They tried, but it never worked out. In terms of the culture that we're living in now, it's...
Well, the point about Helms remains...
No, your point about Helms is absolutely right.
And,
yeah.
You know, there was CIA involvement. It may have been ineffectual.
Yeah, no, they people were killed with CIA weaponry and so forth, but they did it.
I'm saying, I don't think we need to quibble about who ultimately... Yeah,
no,
sure,
that's why
the
I'm mad at
generals
you.
were
You're
ultimately-
making me quibble.
Yeah, but I really... no,
I'm also...
I think the important point is that the CIA got permission to lie at that point to Congress in 1978.
You mean from the New York Times editorial page? That's what you referred to as permission.
Well, in a sense,
They always
that's
had
an
permission
example
to
of
lie.
the media that I'm talking about, the kind of state media role played by the Times.
Okay.
Just as it played in the run-up to the Iraq War.
Okay, I'm
We
gonna
can't just talk about Fox News here.
differ.
We
I'm
can't
gonna
just
differ
talk
with
about
you.
Fox
I'm gonna differ with you in a big way here. I wrote a book called What Liberal Media. I still get little checks for it. On the first page of that book, partially because I'm a professor of English, even though my degree's in history, but for some reason I'm a professor of English. I always make the point that the word media is a plural noun, so that it's grammatically incorrect to say the media is. You have to say the media are. And therefore, it doesn't make any sense to talk about the media. Whatever you say about the media, quote unquote, is going to be true about one part of the media and false about one other part of the media. And it's even true when you get down to institutions like the New York Times, which right now has over 1,300 editorial employees. And some of them are great and some of them are terrible. And it's not, I find it indefensible to say that it's a state media. And the same is true of the Washington Post. There are a lot of people there who are working very hard to tell very uncomfortable truths about our government and our country. And there are a lot of people who are uncomfortable with those truths being told. And it's a constant battle. And sometimes the truth wins and sometimes it doesn't. And that's true in a lot of institutions. The New York Times is a special institution because it's the most important and most influential, and I write about it more than I write about anything else, and I write about it critically 90% of the time. But it's actually, I'd say, the most important private institution we have in terms of maintaining our democracy. Without the New York Times, I would be we wouldn't be as democratic a country as we are. And you know, we could do this all day. You could say, well, they did this, and I could say, yeah, but then they did this, and we go back and forth. But the fact is that the media are a very complicated institution. It's a hydra-headed beast. and the part of the media that requires that tells us the truth requires our support, and yet people talk about it as if it's a monolith, and I think that's dangerous because you can say anything you want about it as a monolith because it's going
Eric,
to be true about someone.
Would you make the same comment about government writ large, the executive? That there's as much good as there is bad, and you just have to, be tolerant that it's an institution in progress? Or would you distinguish between the political institution and the cultural institution?
Well, this is one of the things that's so dangerous about Trump, that this fish is rotting from the head down.
Yeah.
And that he's setting an example of contempt for all the functions of government. I didn't get to
And
say.
culture.
Yeah, well, Lyndon Johnson lied about Vietnam every time he spoke, but under this government, every single policy is Vietnam. No matter where you look, it's incompetent people. It's a failure. They don't care about the truth because the president doesn't care about the truth, and he appoints people who don't care about the truth. And so I think there are a lot of good people in government. I think there are a lot of good people in the Nixon administration and in the Reagan administration trying to do a good job. This is the first time we've had a president who has contempt for the job that government does. Reagan talked that way, but he didn't act that way. And so, again, this is something new. He has contempt for the truth. He has contempt for the job that he does. As Rick says, he's got no politics at all except for his own ego. And we're in uncharted territory in this respect.
Yeah. So we're going to turn to questions because, believe it or not, we're sort of out of our time. But I want you each to, starting with Eric, I want you to each to just reflect on this for a moment, which is, when we're done with this presidency, however it ends, do you think that there will be sort of energy towards rethinking the presidency or the executive? Or do you think, no, we'll just go on like, oh, we hope that doesn't happen again? Or do you really think that there are lessons to be learned here that need to be addressed legislatively, policy-wise?
Well, personally, I don't think you can go back in time very easily. I expected Barack Obama. He's wonderful in a lot of ways and a disappointment in a number of ways. One way in which I was disappointed in him is that he was a constitutional law professor, and yet he didn't rein in the imperial presidency at all. Once he got the power, he liked having it. In our current situation, the other thing that worries me, we're attacking Fox News and the presidency, but the American people have a role here too. Barack Obama, literally, according to the count of the people who keep count of these things, he told fewer falsehoods in 8 years than Trump tells in 10 minutes, quite frequently. I'm not exaggerating.
No.
He told a grand total of 12 falsehoods in 8 years, whereas there was one conversation where Trump was talking to Hannity on the phone, and he told 45 falsehoods in 45 minutes. And yet, our most honest president was replaced by our most dishonest president. For the second time in a row, Jimmy Carter was our other most honest president, and he was replaced by a dishonest president. American people don't care about this. They care if the lies are consistent with their beliefs and their hatreds and their resentments. So people are not demanding the truth. They're demanding comfort. They're demanding reinforcement. And that's what politicians respond to. So the Republican Party is terrible because the people who vote for it are terrible. They would be better if the people who voted for them were better. Now, it's complicated because they get lied to and so forth. But I don't see us going back. I see us living with this in a way that I can't really imagine the future.
Rick, give us some hope about what can be done to make it better. It can't just be, it's going to be bad forever. That's
Well,
not.
since I gave up the practice of commenting on the weekly developments,
Yes.
I've devoted most of my mental energy to what I think is the big problem, and that is, you should excuse the expression, the Constitution. This
I've heard of it.
I know, usually it's right out of the box. The religion of the Constitution is not a good thing. The constant invocation of the framers, the idea that the Federalist Papers is Holy Writ, when even the authors of the Federalist Papers didn't agree with them, they'd reached a compromise and they were out to sell it, and they were right that it was a better deal than so I think we need to rethink the Constitution, and the easiest fix that we can make is to elect the president by popular vote. That can be done without touching the Constitution, and if you may have all heard of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, so I won't go into the details of that. But it is wrong to blame the American people for Trump, and it was wrong to blame the American people for Bush Jr. The American people did not choose. The American people chose otherwise. And in the case of Bush, that could be that could be a planetary catastrophe. If the winner of the popular, so-called popular vote, if the winner of the election in any the way we understand elections had taken office, we would be in a very different place now with respect to so-called climate change, global heating. And the same, of course, is the case for Trump. And Trump seems aware of this. That's why he crazily says that 3 million more votes were stolen in California, and that's why Hillary won the vote of the American people. The American people are doing their best, but the machine is rusty and faulty and broken, and it can be fixed. It can be fixed, but it's not going to be easy, and the odds are against it. But at least we've got maybe a 25% chance of national survival, and that's not too bad.
Thanks a lot. Jackson?
Well, I appreciate that Eric and I both resort from time to time to the historian's trope, which is complexity. And I thoroughly agree that the New York Times is a huge and complex organization, as is the U.S. State Department, as is the freaking CIA. There are good CIA agents. I mean, this is how Cy Hirsch did his best work, was that he found military officers and people in the intelligence community, for that matter, who believed that they had taken an oath to the Constitution rather than to their bosses and to their immediate superiors. And they became the whistleblowers of their day, who supplied him with the material that he used to uncover misdeeds by government. So I thoroughly agree that I agree that media are plural, and that they're plural kinds of possibilities from within each media institution. But the drift of things at this particular moment is discouraging to me, and I'm perfectly willing to do away with the Electoral College. I agree that would be a good thing, but I'm less willing to toss the baby of the Constitution out with the bathwater of the Electoral College, because it seems to me I'm more devoted to the Bill of Rights than to the Constitution. The Constitution is full of a lot of ingenious 18th century mechanisms for balancing and reducing the concentration of power, which have more or less worked for a long time. So I'm not sure we necessarily want to dismantle those mechanisms, but I do think that what is really precious to me in the Constitution is the Bill of Rights. And by the way, it's what was precious to Edward Snowden too, and it's what got him involved in his career of revelations. So I think we're going to need, I think it's going to take a lot of ingenuity, more ingenuity than the current Democratic Party is demonstrating, to redirect the public discourse in a way that needs to be redirected. What I hear among the DNC and the Democratic establishment as well as among most of the major media, is a longing for the status quo anti-Trump. And I don't think that's enough. I think the reason Trump was elected was that there were serious shortcomings in that status quo and in that and in the way that basically neoliberal pro-market forces had taken over the Democratic Party to a large extent, almost as much as they had already taken over the Republican Party, with not quite the same fundamentalist tinge, with more of a technocratic tinge, but they were not satisfying popular needs. And I think that we need a reorientation of the Democratic Party in a way that would satisfy toward what I would call a social democratic direction. And that would involve, I went, a couple of years ago, I and a number of historians and political scientists who'd written about the reform tradition, the progressive tradition in American political history, had been invited by the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation at the Rockefeller Estate in Tarrytown. And there was a lot of talk about philanthropy and good intentions, and until at one point one of my colleagues said, there really is going to have to be, some people are going to have to lose and some people are going to have to get more. There's going to have to be a certain amount of redistribution here. We can't just keep growing. And I think that's the really hard challenge that I think the Democrats or anyone who claims to be an egalitarian faces, is that some people are going to have to pay more than they do now, and to create a decent society. And I think it can happen. I think there's enough goodwill out there. I think there's enough intelligence. I think there's a kind of native brightness in a lot of American people, even if they're not highly educated. I believe in the vernacular intelligence and decency of a lot of people. Maybe they were misled by Trump. Maybe they really do have a mean streak that he tapped into. But in any case, I don't think that we're stuck with expecting that same group of voters to keep voting for the likes of Trump. And the likes of Trump are not likely to, one hopes, come along again anytime soon. So I'm far from being optimistic, I'm sorry to say. I'm cautiously hopeful.
Okay, we'll leave the optimism to you, Jim.
You're more optimistic than you sounded earlier in this discussion. When someone talks about rethinking the Constitution, my heart turns to ice. Over 30 states have passed resolutions calling for an Article 5 convention to rewrite the Constitution. Now, if any of you can convince me that we'll find a George Washington, a Ben Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, James Wilson, so on, in this day and age, who will be elected to a constitutional convention, whether it's in Philadelphia or Kansas City, I don't much care. You're more optimistic than I am. But instrumental changes in the instrument, such as the Interstate Compact, that tries to circumvent the impossibility of changing the Electoral College by main force, by amending the Constitution, is a very promising approach. But I also think that instrumentally and practically and institutionally, which is the way I usually end up thinking about these things, our first order of business, and one that it seems to me incumbent on all of us to enforce upon the Democratic candidates in the plural, and then certainly upon the one who gets the nod at the end of the primaries, is to force them to tell us what we're going to do specifically to clear out the wreckage of this administration. Now, I'm not thinking here about campaign finance reform and things that have been on the agenda of liberal, well-thinking, smart people for decades now, for well over 50 years. I'm not talking about that. I mean very specifically, what's going to be done on day 1, 2, and 3? What are the first actions going to be taken? In what sequence? To redraw the boundaries of political action, political behavior, to get us back in the Paris Accords and so on. I want to hear that from our candidates. These are not constitutional issues necessarily, they're political issues, and they're administrative issues, and I have yet to hear any of the Democratic candidates speaking in those terms. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us as citizens sitting in this room and elsewhere to get hold of our candidates somehow through other people, through people we know, through members of Congress whom we know, and try to bring that to bear upon them. They have to tell us what they're planning to do. We have to know what they're going to do or what they mean to do as soon as one of them takes office, if we're lucky enough.
So it's time for your questions. Wait for the microphone. Remember that this is being recorded. Questions? Over here.
To what extent would you say that a lot of the problem has to do with, shall we say, the triumph of emotionality over rationality in the society on the whole, has to do with this, and this kind of corporate consumer thing that's going on about what somebody wants is more important than what somebody else needs. And just as an example, I just had a discussion with somebody. We were talking about Obamacare, and we all agreed that our health care went up, but then millions of children who were not insured were then insured. And this is more an attitude that's more the exception than the rule these days. Whereas with the generation that went through World War II and the Depression, there was at least an agreement that to make some sacrifices on what you yourself wanted for what somebody else needed. So to what extent is that a factor, and also the triumph of emotionality a factor?
You want to take that? Eric?
2 points about that. Your greatest generation who made those sacrifices, they made them for white people. And once you brought in people of color, people who were different, things got a lot more complicated, and people were much less willing to make sacrifices for people who didn't look like them and share what they understood to be their values and religion, et cetera. So that countries that are cultural are much easier to govern than countries that are not. Secondly, up until recently, we had a pretty narrowly defined elite to which people largely deferred. We had gatekeepers. We had a group of people, the Protestant ethic, who felt a sense of larger commitment to. They did all right for themselves, but they were serious about serving the larger public and the ideals that they were raised to serve at, places like these private schools that instilled these values in them, and Harvard and Yale and Princeton, et cetera. And that elite collapsed for a lot of reasons. Part of it was their own greed and all the money that became available in the 1980s. But part of it was that it just was not sustainable anymore. And the most important element of its destruction is the internet, which democratized information and gave everybody. It used to be that people would argue in very broad terms, but now they know every little thing about every little issue if they want to, and they can create boxes around politicians that politicians can't get out of because they'll face some sort of reaction. It's why fewer than 10% of people support our actual gun control laws, and yet we have these lack of gun control laws, because the 10% of people are going to make your life hell if you try to oppose them. And otherwise, in the past, they wouldn't have known. They wouldn't have had any idea. You could have passed laws about it. They would never have known. So the fact that we've democratized information and that the elite has basically stepped away from its role as a gatekeeper has increased the emotionality of these issues and decreased the ability for sort of gentlemen to get together over brandy and cigars and settle things. And And that's what's made Congress much less fun for everybody and much less effective, because they don't have the freedom, and the president doesn't have the freedom to make the kinds of deals that Rick wanted to see made on the Sequoia anymore, because there's just too many people involved, and they're not the same kinds of people, and they hate each other.
More questions? Thank you for that. Right here.
Hi, I'm Dr. Yael Danieli. Actually, I'm a psychohistorian. That is, we have an international center of multi-generational legacies of trauma. And the question I have, presidents are the ultimate decision makers in terms of future traumas. They always start by start their presidency or the time of running by invoking future generations, right? And the hope for future generations. In effect, many of their decisions are very immediate for the next 4 or 8 years, and they don't give a damn about the impact of those decisions on next generations. I would like your views on that, because it's not only presidents, it's many decision makers, and that is because of the political system. I would like your views on that, because don't you remember when Hitler ran, he was also considered as an idiot by some and not to be taken seriously, and his country went totally behind him. And we know the multi-generational effects of that.
Jackson?
That's a tricky one. I mean, that's a serious and difficult question. And I agree with you that presidents do always talk about future generations. I think that Reagan is a good example of a kind of genial demagogue who is talking the kind of game that gets everybody feeling, or lots of people feeling good, you know, about America is back. And what he meant by America, of course, was let her rip turbo capitalism. But he never had the, I guess what I think you're getting at is the whole problem of leadership. And this also has to do with the balance between emotion and rationality, because leaders have to be able to inspire emotions as well as make convincing logical arguments. And I fear, I'm not trying to shift the ground away from the generational issue, because I think it's critical. On the other hand, I think generational conflict is often worked up as an excuse for and a way to distract people from other more fundamental kinds of conflict. I was suspicious of it back in the Don't Trust Anyone Over 30 days, the Abby Hoffman era, and I'm suspicious of the same kind of cross-generational suspicion now. But I do think we have a problem of leadership in this country, and what it means to be a leader is a very tricky business. And I agree entirely with Eric about how much easier it was for white Americans to care about other white Americans, when the face of poverty was white, and when affirmative action was white, as the historian Ira Katz-Nelson says in his book about the New Deal. And so one of the things we're looking at here that makes it difficult to govern is in fact, we are a more genuinely multicultural democracy than we used to be. And more so all the time as more immigrants arrive. And you know, I teach at Rutgers, which is one of the most diverse schools in the U.S. probably, and it's and even in the I've been there for 30 years, and it's changed dramatically. Even then, I mean, 30 years ago, it was mostly the white sons and daughters of the American New Jersey middle class. It's much more complicated than that, but it's harder then to be a leader who will address a multicultural audience. And I think Obama did it briefly during his campaign. And then as soon as he was nominated, he turned around and accepted what seemed to him, I'm sure, to be inevitable, which was the existing order of the national security state, the political establishment, whatever label you want to put on it. So I think it's very difficult, even to, Obama was there was a moment there in Hyde Park, the night of his election, when this is a small d Democratic triumph. And it was the end of a coup, as far as I was concerned, the end of the Bush administration. At least I was hopefully expecting it to be the end of that coup, that neoconservative coup. But that is, I think that was the great disappointment, and I don't know how, that in Obama's leadership. I mean and I don't know whether he could have stepped up or not. It's certainly. I'm sure he feared the threats to his family, and anyone who really tries to change things in this country is going to be violently threatened.
We have time for...
So I think it's a real challenge to get to press politicians. We have the opportunity to press them and say, well, what about? Let's really talk about what your policies mean for the next generation and the generation after that. And we have the obvious example with climate heating. I like that phrase. It's a little more straightforward. I mean, we believe in plain speech here, right? And so I think it's rhetoric is important. There's no such thing as mere rhetoric. Rhetoric shapes how people feel and think about their own possibilities and the country's possibilities.
I just note that Trump never talks about future generations. Trump never talks about future generations. Never.
No, and several people in his administration have talked about how they don't care about the legacy because they're going to be dead anyway. So that's one of the memes that's come out of it. So,
well, that's the Wall Street mentality. I'll be gone, you'll be gone.
Yeah.
Back from 2008.
There you go.
Famous.
And I
we have
think
one-
you're a little hard on Obama, who had to deal with this constitutional structure. Excuse me. It's one of the, we're running up against this in the current campaign, arguing over Medicare for all versus sort of building on Obamacare. There ain't going to be Medicare for all. That is not, that's a non-starter. And we're setting ourselves up for disappointment and cynicism by pretending that by electing a Democratic president who believes in turning us into Norway, which I would love to see, that would be wonderful. We're setting ourselves up for cynicism by not recognizing that we have to do these things through a very rusty machine. And that machine is not going to give us the kind of change that Bernie, for example, is talking about. It just ain't going to happen.
Okay, we have time for one more question. A quick question and a quick answer. Jim.
Hi. I want to mention the extra-constitutional impulse or meta-constitutional, or and this very quick examples. I would say Bush v. Gore is an extra-constitutional travesty. I would say, now this might not be this popular, but that said, I think the decapitation of the liberal leadership in the 60s, covered over by the quote-unquote lone gunman phenomenon, embraced by the media and comforting the public, is a second thing that the historical consensus rejects out of hand. And the third thing, under your boy Truman, I'm very taken by what Carl Bernstein revealed about Clark Clifford telling him in an interview that Truman and I, we weren't afraid of the Red Scare and the Red Menace. So to me, these are rather very anti-constitutional and extra-constitutional points that one could then maybe try to digest, but not explain away that by saying that the Constitution, has no real water. When I think we ought to start living up to the Constitution, and then go from there and get a lot better. But to sort of dismiss it when you see these kinds of extra constitutional monstrosities, and there's many more than this. But I just picked 3 just to pepper our stew here.
Jim, you want to comment? Okay, so we're out of time. Because that was more of a comment than a question, so it's good, and I thank you for it. Couple things before I make any concluding remarks. The first is vital interests. On Thursdays, the center has a new online publication meant to inform the public about foreign policy, just in case your leaders don't want to. And it runs the gamut from tariffs in China to Afghanistan and climate change. And it is the wonkiest, intentionally most deep dive into things you should know and you might want to know about. And it comes out on Thursdays, or you can link to it in the morning brief any day. But you should read it. It's fantastic. And so I just wanted to mention that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we have 2 more events this semester. I don't know how that happened, but anyway, we have 2 in December. One is on December 12th, and it's about high-power cyber in geopolitics, cyber offensive cyber attacks, and it is an eye-opener by Andy Greenberg, who wrote the book Sandworm, and you really should come. He's just phenomenal. And then Peter Bergen has a new book on Trump and his generals about national security and the national security state and how it morphed via the generals who were so powerful in the first years of the Trump administration, and that is on December 17th. So I invite you back for both of those. So my concluding remarks are couple things that weren't mentioned tonight, because that sort of concluding remarks, but one is the issue of the Constitution. I think that is going to become a really important point of debate, not a point of let's have the religion of the Constitution, but a point of debate. I do think something that wasn't mentioned, balance of powers. This was all seen as a discussion within the executive. And I think that we didn't have enough time, but I do think thinking about the balance of powers is the next, we have to talk about that and what that means, whether we revise the Constitution or don't revise the Constitution. A third thing is, this is my plea, that in terms of going forward, and I think you all touched on sort of these cultural discomforts, whether it's that we accept lying, that we accept that the culture accepts the lack of privacy, that these things have changed since our childhood, whatever that is, a long time ago. And I think that what we need to do is have this same panel with 30-year-olds and sort of seriously, and see how they think about these issues and whether they think about these issues. And if they don't think about these issues, then what are they thinking about? Because believe me, they're not like this administration. They are thinking about the future and the fact that they, want to be here for the future and are going to be here for the future. So I think I had a lot of other things to say, but I think I'll just leave it at that. So we'll reconvene with some younger folks at some point. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. And yes, and one more thing. There's a book signing out in the hall, so sorry. And Jim will be signing the Presidential Misconduct book, which you should all read. Okay, thank you.